Marcus Thompson adjusted his tie as he walked into the small-town diner, the bell above the door chiming softly. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the checkered floor, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. He had been driving for 3 hours straight, making his way to the quiet town of Millbrook to visit his elderly Aunt Sarah, who had been struggling with her health lately. The diner was typical of small towns across America: red vinyl booths, a counter with spinning stools, and locals who knew each other's names and life stories. Marcus chose a booth near the window, wanting to stretch his legs and grab a quick meal before continuing to his aunt's house. He was dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, looking like any other traveler passing through town. As he settled into his seat, Marcus noticed the atmosphere in the diner was tense. Conversations were hushed, and people kept glancing toward a table in the corner where 3 men sat. They were loud and aggressive, their voices carrying across the small space as they made crude jokes and inappropriate comments to the young waitress serving them. The waitress, barely out of her teens with blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, was clearly uncomfortable. Her hands shook slightly as she refilled their coffee cups, and she avoided making eye contact. The men seemed to enjoy her discomfort, laughing as she hurried away from their table. "Hey, sweetheart, where are you going so fast?" one of them called out, causing her to stumble slightly. The other customers in the diner looked down at their plates, unwilling to get involved. This was clearly not the first time these men had caused trouble in the establishment. Marcus watched the scene unfold, his trained eye taking in details that others might miss. The 3 men were in their 30s, wearing leather jackets and heavy boots. Tattoos covered their arms, and their behavior suggested they were used to intimidating people without consequence. The largest of the group, a man with a shaved head and a scar running down his left cheek, seemed to be the leader. The young waitress approached Marcus's table, her notepad trembling in her hands. "What can I get you, sir?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a coffee and a burger, please," Marcus replied with a kind smile, trying to put her at ease. "And take your time. There's no rush." As she turned to leave, the scarred man's voice boomed across the diner again. "Jenny, get over here and give us some more of that special service." The comment was followed by crude laughter from his companions, and Jenny's face turned red with embarrassment and fear. The elderly cook behind the counter, a man who looked like he'd been working there for decades, shook his head in disgust but said nothing. The other customers continued to mind their own business, creating an atmosphere of silent tension that hung over the entire establishment like a dark cloud. Marcus could see that Jenny was struggling to maintain her composure. Her eyes were watering, and she was fighting back tears as she tried to do her job. The 3 men continued their harassment, making increasingly inappropriate comments and gestures that made everyone in the diner uncomfortable. When Jenny brought Marcus his coffee, her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly spilled it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not usually this clumsy." "You're doing fine," Marcus assured her, his voice calm and steady. He had dealt with bullies and criminals throughout his career, but seeing this young woman being terrorized in what should have been a safe workplace made his blood boil. However, he knew that revealing his true identity too soon could escalate the situation unnecessarily. The harassment continued as Marcus ate his meal, each comment from the 3 men becoming more aggressive and threatening. They seemed to feed off each other's energy, pushing boundaries and seeing how far they could go without consequences. The leader with the scar made a particularly vulgar suggestion about what Jenny should do after her shift, causing her to drop her order pad and flee toward the kitchen. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the diner had heard the comment, and the disgust on their faces was evident. Yet still no one spoke up. Fear had paralyzed the entire establishment, allowing these 3 bullies to control the atmosphere through intimidation and the threat of violence. Marcus finished his coffee slowly, observing the dynamics in the room. He noticed how the 3 men carried themselves, the way they positioned their chairs to have a clear view of the entire diner, and how they seemed to be waiting for someone to challenge them. They were predators who had found easy prey in this quiet town, and they clearly enjoyed the power they wielded through fear. As he prepared to pay his bill, Marcus saw Jenny emerge from the kitchen, her eyes red from crying. The cook had apparently given her a pep talk, because she was trying to put on a brave face as she returned to work. But when she approached the troublemaker's table to clear their plates, the leader grabbed her wrist roughly. "Where do you think you're going, sweetheart?" he growled, his grip tightening. "We ain't done with you yet." Jenny tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. Fear filled her eyes as she realized she was trapped, and panic began to set in. The other customers looked away, unable to watch but too frightened to intervene. The cook started to move from behind the counter but stopped when one of the other men glared at him menacingly. Marcus stood up from his booth, his movements deliberate and controlled. He had seen enough, and his years of training told him that this situation was about to escalate into something much worse if he didn't act. The three men hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on terrorizing Jenny to pay attention to the quiet stranger who had been sitting by the window. As he walked toward their table, Marcus's demeanor remained calm and non-threatening. He knew that sometimes the most effective approach was to appear harmless until the moment action was required. These men had no idea that they were about to encounter someone who had spent years dealing with far more dangerous criminals than themselves. Marcus approached the table with measured steps, his hands relaxed at his sides. The three men were so focused on intimidating Jenny that they didn't notice him until he was standing right beside their booth. The scarred leader still had his grip on Jenny's wrist, and she was wincing in pain while trying unsuccessfully to break free. "Excuse me," Marcus said in a calm, even tone that cut through the tension in the diner. "I think the young lady would like you to let go of her." The three men looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting anyone in the quiet diner to challenge them. The scarred leader slowly released Jenny's wrist but remained seated, sizing up this unexpected interference. His two companions shifted in their seats, ready to back up their leader if things turned physical. "And who the hell are you?" the leader sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "This ain't your business, stranger. Keep walking if you know what's good for you." Jenny rubbed her wrist where red marks were already forming, grateful for the intervention but terrified about what might happen next. She had seen these men around town before, and she knew they had a reputation for violence. The last thing she wanted was for this kind stranger to get hurt because of her. "Sir, please," Jenny whispered to Marcus. "Just leave it alone. They're not worth the trouble." But Marcus didn't move. He studied the three men carefully, noting their positioning, their body language, and the subtle signs that told him they were likely armed. The bulge under the leader's jacket suggested a concealed weapon, and the way the man on the right kept his hand near his hip indicated he was carrying something as well. "The lady asked you to leave her alone," Marcus continued, his voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. "I think it would be best if you finished your meal and moved on." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the silent diner. "You got some nerve, I'll give you that. But you picked the wrong guys to mess with." He stood up slowly, revealing his full height of about 6 feet and 2 inches. His companions followed suit, forming a semicircle around Marcus. The other customers in the diner watched in horror, some reaching for their phones to call for help. But everyone knew that the nearest police station was 20 minutes away, and a lot could happen in that time. The elderly cook gripped a wooden spoon tightly, wanting to help but knowing he would be no match for these younger, stronger men. "Last chance, hero," the scarred man said, stepping closer to Marcus. "Walk away now or we're going to teach you some manners the hard way." Marcus remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed but alert. Years of training had taught him to read dangerous situations, and he could see that these men were used to people backing down when faced with their intimidation tactics. They had probably never encountered someone who didn't show fear in their presence. "I appreciate the warning," Marcus replied, "but I can't do that. The young lady deserves to work without being harassed." The tension in the diner reached a breaking point. The scarred leader clenched his fists, his face reddening with anger. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by some nobody in a small-town diner. His reputation in Millbrook was built on fear and violence, and he couldn't allow this stranger to undermine that. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," the leader growled, pulling back his jacket slightly to reveal the handle of a pistol tucked into his waistband. "You see this? This is what happens to people who don't mind their own business." Several customers gasped at the sight of the weapon, and Jenny let out a small cry of fear. The cook reached for the phone behind the counter, but one of the other men noticed and shook his head threateningly. The message was clear. No one was calling for help. Marcus glanced at the weapon but showed no sign of fear or surprise. Instead, he seemed to relax even further, which confused the three men. Most people would have either run away or begged for mercy at this point, but this stranger was acting like he'd been in similar situations before. "That's an interesting piece," Marcus observed, his tone conversational. "Looks like a 9mm. You have a permit for that?" The question caught the leader off guard. No one had ever asked him about permits before. Usually just showing the gun was enough to end any confrontation. The casual way the stranger was discussing the weapon was unnerving. "I don't need no stinking permit," the leader snarled, his hand moving toward the gun. "This is all the authority I need in this town." "Actually," Marcus said, his voice taking on a slightly different quality, "you do need a permit. And based on your record, I'm guessing you don't have one." The three men exchanged confused glances. How could this stranger possibly know anything about their records? The leader's hand stopped just short of his weapon, uncertainty creeping into his expression for the first time. "What are you talking about?" the man on the left demanded. "You don't know nothing about us?" Marcus smiled slightly, and there was something in that smile that made all three men uncomfortable. It wasn't the nervous smile of someone trying to defuse a situation. It was the confident smile of someone who held all the cards. "Tommy Breslin," Marcus said, looking directly at the scarred leader. "2 arrests for assault, 1 for weapons possession, currently on probation. Your friend there is Danny Walsh. 3 DUIs and a domestic violence charge. And the quiet one is Mike Peterson, drug possession and theft." The color drained from all 3 faces as Marcus recited their criminal histories with perfect accuracy. How could this random stranger in a small-town diner possibly know such detailed information about them? The leader's hand moved away from his weapon as confusion replaced anger. "Who are you?" Tommy whispered, his voice no longer carrying the same confident threat it had moments before. The entire diner was silent, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. Jenny stood frozen, unsure whether to run or stay. The cook had stopped reaching for the phone, sensing that the dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. Marcus reached slowly into his back pocket, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The 3 men tensed, unsure what to expect. When his hand emerged, he was holding a simple leather wallet. With practiced ease, he flipped it open to reveal a badge and identification card that gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights. "Special Agent Marcus Thompson, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said calmly, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. "And you gentlemen are under arrest." The effect of Marcus revealing his FBI badge was immediate and dramatic. Tommy Breslin's face went from confused anger to pure shock, his mouth falling open as he stared at the federal identification. Danny Walsh took an involuntary step backward, nearly tripping over his chair, while Mike Peterson's hands began to shake visibly. The entire diner erupted in whispers and gasps as word spread that there was an FBI agent among them. Jenny's eyes widened in disbelief, unable to process that the quiet stranger who had ordered a simple burger and coffee was actually a federal law enforcement officer. "You're lying," Tommy stammered, though his voice lacked any conviction. "You can't be FBI, you're just some guy passing through town." Marcus kept his badge visible, allowing everyone in the diner to see the official seal and his photograph. "I can assure you, Mr. Breslin, this badge is very real. Just like the federal warrant that was issued for your arrest 3 days ago." The blood drained completely from Tommy's face. He had been hiding out in Millbrook precisely because he thought no one would look for him in such a small, out-of-the-way place. The warrant was for violating his probation by associating with known criminals and possessing an illegal firearm. Exactly what he was doing right now. "Now," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when making arrests, "I need all 3 of you to put your hands where I can see them and slowly move away from the table." Danny Walsh, who had been drinking heavily before Marcus arrived, was the first to panic. "This is bullshit," he shouted, starting to move toward the door. "I ain't done nothing wrong." "Stop right there, Mr. Walsh," Marcus commanded, his hand moving to his own concealed weapon. "Take another step and I'll consider you a flight risk." The deadly serious tone in Marcus's voice froze Danny in his tracks. Years of FBI training had taught Marcus how to project authority and control in dangerous situations, and that training was evident now. Even though he was outnumbered 3-1, he had complete command of the situation. Mike Peterson, who had remained mostly silent throughout the entire confrontation, suddenly found his voice. "Look, Agent Thompson, we didn't know who you were. We were just having some fun with the waitress. No harm done, right? Sexual harassment, intimidation, and public display of an illegal weapon constitute more than having fun, Mr. Peterson, Marcus replied coolly. Not to mention that Mr. Breslin here is wanted on federal charges. The cook behind the counter had stopped pretending to work and was openly staring at the unfolding drama. Other customers had their phones out, some recording the scene while others were finally calling the local police. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from fear to fascination as people realized they were witnessing a real federal arrest. Tommy's hand twitched toward his weapon again, desperation beginning to override his common sense. Being arrested by the FBI would mean serious prison time, and he knew his criminal record wouldn't earn him any sympathy from a federal judge. I wouldn't recommend that course of action, Marcus said, noticing the movement. Drawing a weapon on a federal agent carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years. Is that really how you want this to end? The weight of those words settled over Tommy like a physical blow. 10 years in federal prison for drawing his gun, plus whatever time he would get for the existing warrant and the charges from today's incident. His criminal career was effectively over, and he knew it. Jenny, who had been watching the entire scene in amazement, finally found her voice. Agent Thompson, is it really true? Are you really with the FBI? Marcus glanced at her briefly, his expression softening when he saw the young woman who had been so terrified just minutes earlier. Yes, miss. I'm sorry you had to go through that ordeal. No one should have to deal with harassment at their workplace. The validation from a federal agent gave Jenny a surge of confidence she hadn't felt all day. For weeks, these 3 men had been making her life miserable, and she had felt powerless to stop them. Now finally, someone with real authority was holding them accountable. They've been coming in here for months, she said, her voice growing stronger, harassing me and the other waitresses, threatening customers, making everyone afraid. We called the local police, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless someone actually got hurt. Marcus nodded grimly. This was a common problem in small towns where local law enforcement lacked the resources or jurisdiction to deal with certain types of criminals. Federal agents often found themselves stepping in when local authorities were overwhelmed. Well, that changes today, Marcus assured her. These men will be held accountable for their actions. Danny Walsh, still hoping to find a way out of the situation, tried a different approach. Come on, Agent Thompson, we're just small-time guys. You must have bigger fish to fry than us. Can't we work something out? The size of the fish doesn't matter, Mr. Walsh, Marcus replied. What matters is that you threatened and intimidated innocent people. The FBI takes civil rights violations very seriously, regardless of whether they happen in a big city or a small town. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance as the local police finally responded to the multiple calls from the diner. Tommy knew his time was running out, and desperation was making him consider increasingly dangerous options. The federal warrant meant he would be looking at serious time, and the thought of spending years in prison was driving him toward panic. Look, Tommy said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. Maybe we can make a deal. I know things about other people, bigger criminals than us. I could help you with your investigations. Marcus had heard this offer countless times throughout his career. Small-time criminals always thought they had information valuable enough to trade for their freedom. But most of the time, their knowledge was limited to other small-time criminals. That's not how this works, Mr. Breslin, Marcus explained. Any cooperation would have to be discussed with federal prosecutors after you're in custody. Right now, my job is to arrest you and ensure the safety of everyone in this diner. The sirens were getting closer, and the 3 men could see flashing lights approaching through the diner's windows. Local police backup would arrive within minutes, making any escape attempt virtually impossible. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in completely. Mike Peterson, who had been quietly calculating his options, suddenly raised his hands in surrender. I give up, he announced. I'm not going to make this worse than it already is. His surrender seemed to deflate the fight in Danny Walsh as well. The reality was that they were caught, and any resistance would only add to their charges. With visible resignation, Danny also raised his hands. Only Tommy remained defiant, his hand still hovering near his weapon. The arrival of local police would mean the end of his freedom, and the desperate part of his mind was still searching for a way out of the situation. 2 police cars pulled into the diner's parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing against the windows. The local officers who stepped out were surprised to find an FBI agent already on the scene, but they quickly coordinated with Marcus to secure the situation. The lead officer, Sergeant Rodriguez, had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 15 years and had never dealt with a federal case before. "Agent Thompson," Sergeant Rodriguez said as he entered the diner, "we got multiple calls about a disturbance." "What's the situation?" Marcus gestured toward the three men, two of whom still had their hands raised while Tommy remained frozen in indecision. "Three suspects, one with an outstanding federal warrant: sexual harassment of an employee, intimidation of customers, and illegal weapons possession. I'll need to coordinate with your department for processing." The presence of uniformed officers seemed to break Tommy's last thread of resistance. He could see that his options had run out completely. With local police, an FBI agent, and a diner full of witnesses, any attempt at escape or violence would be suicide. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his hands as well. "Smart choice, Mr. Breslin," Marcus said as Sergeant Rodriguez moved to secure the illegal weapon. "Officer, you'll want to handle that pistol carefully. It's likely unregistered and may be connected to other crimes." Jenny watched in amazement as the three men who had terrorized her for months were finally being held accountable. The other customers in the diner were equally fascinated, many of them recording the arrests on their phones. This would be the biggest news story in Millbrook in years. As the local officers began the process of handcuffing the suspects, Marcus took a moment to address the gathering crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience during this situation. The immediate threat has been neutralized, and these men will be facing serious federal charges." The elderly cook approached Marcus with obvious gratitude. "Agent, I can't thank you enough. These troublemakers have been driving away customers for weeks. We were all too scared to do anything about it." "That's exactly why we need to stand up to bullies," Marcus replied. "Fear is their primary weapon, and once people stop being afraid, they lose their power." Sergeant Rodriguez had finished securing Tommy's weapon and was now reading all three men their Miranda rights. The process was being handled professionally, but Marcus could see that the local officers were excited to be part of a federal case. For small-town cops, this kind of situation was both rare and career-defining. Danny Walsh, who had been relatively quiet since surrendering, suddenly became agitated as the reality of his situation hit him. "This is crazy," he protested. "All we did was talk to some waitress. Since when is that a federal crime?" "Since you did it while your friend was brandishing an illegal weapon," Marcus explained patiently. "When crimes cross state lines or involve federal violations, they become FBI jurisdiction. Mr. Breslin's warrant makes this a federal matter." Mike Peterson shook his head in disbelief as an officer secured his hands behind his back. He had thought Millbrook would be a safe place to lay low for a while, somewhere the law wouldn't bother looking for small-time criminals like themselves. The presence of an off-duty FBI agent was the worst possible luck. "How did you even know about our records?" Mike asked as he was being led toward a police car. "What are the odds of running into a Fed in a place like this?" Marcus smiled slightly as he watched the arrest process. "Sometimes justice finds you when you least expect it. Maybe you should have chosen a different diner for lunch." Jenny approached Marcus as the last of the three men was being loaded into police cars. Her confidence had returned completely now that her tormentors were in custody, and she wanted to express her gratitude properly. "Agent Thompson, I don't know how to thank you enough," she said, tears of relief in her eyes. "These men have been making my life hell for months. I was starting to think about quitting my job because I couldn't take it anymore." "You don't need to thank me, Jenny," Marcus replied kindly. "You deserve to feel safe at work. No one should have to tolerate harassment and intimidation." Sergeant Rodriguez approached with a clipboard full of paperwork. "Agent Thompson, we'll need to coordinate with your office for processing these suspects. The federal warrant takes priority, but we'd like to file local charges as well." "Absolutely," Marcus agreed. "I'll contact my field office and make sure everything is handled properly. These men need to face consequences for their actions in this community." As the police cars pulled away with their prisoners, the atmosphere in the diner began to return to normal. Customers who had been silent with fear were now talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. The story would spread throughout Millbrook within hours, and by evening, everyone in town would know about the FBI agent who had brought justice to their community. The cook insisted on preparing Marcus a fresh meal, refusing to accept payment for his earlier order. "It's the least we can do," he said gratefully. You've given us our diner back." Other customers approached Marcus throughout the afternoon, thanking him for his intervention and sharing their own stories about encounters with Tommy Breslin and his associates. It became clear that these three men had been terrorizing the entire community, not just the diner staff. An elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson told Marcus how the men had vandalized her garden when she refused to give them money. A young father described how they had threatened him when he asked them to stop using profanity in front of his children at the local park. Story after story revealed a pattern of bullying and intimidation that had made life miserable for many residents. They thought they owned this town, Mrs. Henderson said angrily. Nobody could stand up to them because they were always threatening violence. "Thank God you were here today." Marcus listened to each story with growing concern. The three men had clearly been operating with impunity for months, possibly years. The federal charges would ensure they faced serious consequences, but it was troubling that local law enforcement hadn't been able to address the problem earlier. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what had been happening in Millbrook. The three arrestees weren't just petty criminals. They were domestic terrorists who had used fear and violence to control an entire community. Their arrest would send a message that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated, regardless of how remote or small a town might be. Jenny's shift was ending, and she approached Marcus one final time before leaving. "Agent Thompson, will you be testifying when this goes to trial? I want to make sure these men can't hurt anyone else." "I'll be there," Marcus assured her, "and so will every other witness who's willing to speak up. Justice works best when good people are willing to stand together against bullies." As evening approached, Marcus finally prepared to leave the diner and continue his journey to visit his aunt. The simple lunch stop had turned into a major federal case, but he felt satisfied knowing that three dangerous criminals were off the streets and a community could finally feel safe again. 3 weeks later, Marcus returned to Millbrook for the preliminary hearings. The federal courthouse was located in the neighboring county, but the impact of the arrests had rippled throughout the small town. As he drove down Main Street, Marcus noticed immediate changes in the community's atmosphere. The diner was bustling with customers who had previously avoided it out of fear. Jenny was working her shift with a confidence and smile that hadn't been there during his first visit. When she spotted Marcus entering, her face lit up with genuine happiness. "Agent Thompson," she called out cheerfully. "Welcome back. Your usual table is ready." The transformation in Jenny was remarkable. Gone was the nervous, frightened young woman who had served him weeks ago. In her place was someone who carried herself with dignity and purpose. The change was so dramatic that other customers noticed and commented on it. "That girl has really come into her own since those troublemakers got arrested," commented an elderly man at the counter. "It's like watching a flower bloom after a long winter." Marcus took his seat at the same booth where he had first observed the harassment taking place. The memory of that afternoon felt surreal now, considering how much had changed in such a short time. The federal investigation had uncovered far more criminal activity than anyone had initially suspected. Sergeant Rodriguez entered the diner and spotted Marcus immediately. The local officer approached with a folder full of documents and an expression of deep satisfaction. Over the past 3 weeks, he had been working closely with the FBI to build the strongest possible case against the three arrestees. "Agent Thompson, I'm glad you're back in town," Rodriguez said, settling into the booth across from him. "The preliminary hearing is tomorrow, but I wanted to update you on what we've discovered since the arrests." The investigation had revealed that Tommy Breslin, Danny Walsh, and Mike Peterson were part of a larger criminal network operating throughout several rural counties. They had been using intimidation and violence to extort money from small business owners, threatening anyone who refused to pay their protection fees. The state police found evidence linking them to at least 12 other businesses, Rodriguez explained. Restaurant owners, shopkeepers, even a few farmers were paying them monthly fees to avoid harassment. This was organized crime on a small scale, but crime nonetheless. Marcus wasn't surprised by these revelations. His years of experience had taught him that criminals who operated openly in one location were usually involved in additional illegal activities. The harassment at the diner had been just the tip of the iceberg. Jenny approached their table with coffee and overheard part of the conversation. 12 other businesses?" she asked in amazement. "I had no idea they were doing this to other people too." That's how these operations work, Marcus explained. They target people who feel isolated and powerless. Small business owners in rural areas often don't think they have anywhere to turn for help. The federal charges against the three men were extensive. Tommy Breslin faced federal weapons violations, extortion, conspiracy, and violation of his existing probation. Danny Walsh and Mike Peterson were charged with conspiracy, intimidation, and civil rights violations. All three were being held without bail due to the flight risk they presented. Their defense attorney is trying to negotiate plea bargains, Rodriguez informed Marcus. But the prosecutor isn't interested in reducing the charges. This case has attracted attention from the U.S. Attorney's Office because it represents a pattern of domestic terrorism. The term domestic terrorism might have seemed strong for the actions of three small-town bullies, but Marcus understood the classification. They had used systematic intimidation and violence to control an entire community, which fell squarely within federal definitions of terrorism. As they discussed the case, other members of the community approached their table. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman whose garden had been vandalized, wanted to thank Marcus again for his intervention. The young father who had been threatened at the park shook his hand gratefully. "My kids can play at the park again without me worrying," the father said emotionally. "You don't know what that means to a parent." One by one, business owners from around town stopped by to share their stories. The owner of the hardware store revealed that he had been paying Tommy Breslin $50 a week for months, after being threatened with property damage. The woman who ran the local bakery admitted that she had considered closing her business rather than continuing to deal with the harassment. "We all knew what was happening," explained the hardware store owner, "but we felt helpless to stop it. These guys had the whole town scared, and we didn't think anyone would believe us or be able to do anything about it." Marcus listened to each story with growing admiration for the courage these people were now showing. Standing up to testify against their former tormentors took real bravery, especially in a small community where everyone knew each other's business. The cook from the diner, whose name Marcus learned was Frank, brought over a slice of homemade apple pie. "On the house," Frank insisted. "I've been cooking in this diner for 25 years, and those 3 weeks when those men were in jail were the most peaceful I've ever experienced here." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus began to understand the full extent of the positive changes that had occurred since the arrests. Property crimes had dropped dramatically throughout the county. Business revenues were up as customers felt safe returning to establishments they had previously avoided. Most importantly, the community was rediscovering its sense of unity and mutual support. Jenny's manager, a middle-aged woman named Carol, approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "I want to thank you for giving me my employee back," she said. "Jenny was ready to quit, and I don't know what we would have done without her. She's the best waitress we've ever had." The preliminary hearing the next day would be a formality, but it represented something much more significant for the community. It was their chance to publicly reclaim their town from the criminals who had held it hostage through fear and intimidation. "Will you be staying for the hearing tomorrow?" Rodriguez asked as their conversation wound down. "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied. "This case represents everything the FBI stands for, protecting communities from those who would exploit the innocent and vulnerable." As evening approached, Marcus prepared to leave the diner for his hotel. The simple meal stop that had changed everything was now just a memory, but its impact would be felt in Millbrook for years to come. The three men who had thought they could intimidate an entire town had learned that justice could arrive when they least expected it. Jenny approached his table one final time as he prepared to pay his bill. "Agent Thompson, I know I keep thanking you, but I need you to understand something. You didn't just arrest 3 criminals that day. You gave all of us our lives back." The sincerity in her voice touched Marcus deeply. Throughout his career, he had worked on cases involving major criminal organizations, international conspiracies, and high-profile investigations. But this small-town case had reminded him why he had joined the FBI in the first place: to protect ordinary people from those who would do them harm. As he left the diner that evening, Marcus reflected on the power of standing up to bullies. 3 men had controlled an entire community through fear and intimidation, but it had only taken one person willing to say no to break their hold completely. Sometimes the most important cases weren't the ones that made headlines, but the ones that restored faith in justice to communities that had lost hope. 6 months after the arrests, Marcus received an invitation that brought a smile to his face. The town of Millbrook was hosting its first annual Community Safety Day, and they wanted him to be the guest of honor. The event was designed to celebrate the restoration of peace and security to their small community. Marcus arrived in Millbrook on a beautiful Saturday morning to find Main Street decorated with colorful banners and bustling with activity. The transformation was even more dramatic than he had witnessed during his previous visits. The town had clearly regained its sense of pride and community spirit. The diner, which had become the symbolic center of the community's recovery, was serving as headquarters for the day's events. Jenny, now promoted to assistant manager, greeted Marcus with a warm hug and a beaming smile that spoke volumes about how far she had come. "Agent Thompson, welcome back to our town," she said enthusiastically. "Wait until you see what we've accomplished since the trial." The federal trial had concluded 2 months earlier with convictions on all charges. Tommy Breslin received a 15-year federal sentence, while Danny Walsh and Mike Peterson each got 8 years. The sentences had sent a clear message throughout the region that domestic terrorism and organized intimidation would not be tolerated. Mayor Patricia Williams, a woman in her 60s who had been elected in a special election after the previous mayor was discovered to have been receiving payments from Breslin's organization, approached Marcus with obvious excitement. "Agent Thompson, I can't begin to express how grateful our community is for what you did," she said warmly. "Your actions that day didn't just stop 3 criminals. They inspired all of us to take back our town." The mayor explained how the arrests had catalyzed a complete transformation in Millbrook's civic engagement. Citizens who had been too afraid to participate in local government were now attending town meetings regularly. Business owners who had been paying extortion fees were reinvesting that money in improvements to their establishments. Property values were rising as people felt safe moving to the area again. As Marcus walked through the festival, he encountered familiar faces from that day in the diner. Mrs. Henderson had replanted her garden and was now leading a neighborhood watch program. The young father he had met was coaching Little League baseball, using the park that had previously been controlled by the criminals. Frank, the diner cook, had opened a second restaurant across town with his savings from no longer paying protection fees. The hardware store owner had expanded his business and hired 2 new employees. Every story Marcus heard reinforced the same theme. The community had been reborn after years of living under the shadow of fear. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been promoted to lieutenant following his work on the federal case, gave Marcus a tour of the new community policing initiatives that had been implemented. The success of the investigation had brought additional resources and training to the local police department. "We've established partnerships with surrounding counties and state police," Rodriguez explained proudly. "We're never going to let organized criminals establish a foothold in our community again." The police department had also implemented a new reporting system that made it easier for citizens to report intimidation and extortion. Anonymous tip lines had been established, and regular community meetings ensured that law enforcement stayed connected with the people they served. Jenny approached them as they toured the police station, carrying a folder thick with paperwork. Her role as assistant manager had expanded to include community outreach, and she had become one of the town's most effective advocates for victims' rights. "Agent Thompson, I wanted to show you something special," she said, opening the folder to reveal dozens of letters and photographs. "These are thank you notes from people throughout the region who were inspired by our story to stand up to bullies in their own communities." The impact of the Millbrook case had spread far beyond the town limits. News coverage of the arrests and trial had inspired similar investigations in neighboring counties. Other victims of organized intimidation had come forward, leading to additional arrests and convictions throughout the region. One letter particularly caught Marcus's attention. It was from a teenage girl in a town 50 miles away who had been able to report bullying at her school after reading about Jenny's courage in testifying against her harassers. The girl credited the Millbrook story with giving her the strength to speak up. "This is what makes it all worthwhile," Marcus said, genuinely moved by the ripple effects of their actions. "When good people find the courage to stand up for what's right, it inspires others to do the same." The afternoon's main event was a ceremony recognizing the citizens who had shown courage during the crisis and its aftermath. Jenny received an award for her bravery in testifying, while Frank was honored for keeping his business open and supporting his employees throughout the intimidation campaign. Mrs. Henderson was recognized for organizing the Neighborhood Watch program, and the hardware store owner received an award for his efforts to support other local businesses. Each story highlighted how ordinary people had found extraordinary courage when faced with injustice. When Marcus was called to the podium to address the crowd, he looked out at hundreds of faces that reflected pride, determination, and hope. The transformation from the fearful, intimidated community he had first encountered was nothing short of remarkable. 6 months ago, I walked into a diner expecting nothing more than a quick meal, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. What I found instead was a community that had lost its way, held hostage by criminals who used fear as their weapon. He paused, making eye contact with Jenny, Frank, Mrs. Henderson, and the other brave individuals who had turned their trauma into positive action. But what those criminals didn't understand was that courage is contagious. When one person decides to stand up for what's right, it gives others permission to find their own courage. Jenny's willingness to testify, Frank's determination to keep serving his community, Mrs. Henderson's efforts to organize her neighbors, these are the actions that truly defeated the criminals. The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus raised his hand to continue. The real victory here wasn't the arrests or the convictions, though those were important. The real victory was this community rediscovering its own strength and determination. You've proven that no one has the right to steal your sense of safety and security. As the ceremony concluded and the festival continued into the evening, Marcus reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. A simple lunch stop had evolved into one of the most personally meaningful cases of his career. The 3 men who had thought they could intimidate an entire town had learned a hard lesson about the consequences of their actions. But more importantly, a community had learned that they possessed the power to protect themselves and each other from those who would do them harm. As Marcus prepared to leave Millbrook that evening, he knew that his work there was truly complete. The town no longer needed an FBI agent to feel safe. They had rediscovered their own strength and unity. Sometimes the most important victories weren't won in courtrooms or through headlines, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people refusing to be victims. The diner where it all began would continue serving meals to travelers passing through, but it would also stand as a symbol of what was possible when good people decided to take a stand against injustice. And somewhere on a highway leading away from Millbrook, Marcus Thompson smiled, knowing that justice had found its way to exactly where it was needed most.